Hello and welcome everybody. I just wanted to say, please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. In the event that we reach a capacity of 350 people on Teams, the event will be available to watch the live stream that will be posted in the chat. Automatic closed captioning is available for this event and all future events in this series. Note that it must be enabled individually. So if you'd like to turn it on, this feature currently, click on the 3 ellipses at the top right corner of your screen and click on Turn on Live Captions. The words should appear at the bottom of your screen. Transcripts can also be provided by request after the event. Should you have any accessibility concerns during the event, please contact Adrian Blackwell. His contact information will be posted in the chat. We ask that all participants stay muted throughout the event. At the end, there will be a Q&A where we'll take questions from the audience. At that time, you can raise your hand and ask a question, or you can type your question in the chat. If you're at or nearing capacity, Jane Hutton will also be moderating the chat and live stream and relaying those questions here. We ask that participants keep their videos off until the Q&A portion of the event so that our speakers' videos can stay pinned and visible. And that sums up our technical accessibility concerns. Let's get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Hutton, and I'm a faculty member at Waterloo Architecture, and I'm really happy to welcome everybody to the 5th event in this year's Ariscraft Speaker Series, What is Solidarity? Each of these events has brought together researchers, activists, and designers working in different ways on shared agendas. The conversations have been a chance to reflect on how architects can participate in long-term social movements for change. The series has been curated by students representing the student-led groups Treaty Lands, Global Stories, Sustainability Collective, and Bridge, along with faculty members. And we're really grateful to Ariscraft for supporting these conversations, to the speakers, and all of you who've joined us, and to Amy Townsend, Fred Hunsberger, and Mehdi Lachance for their work to make everything happen. So tonight's event focuses on the matter of construction. We know that the materials that designers specify stay just a short while as buildings, infrastructure, and constructed landscapes, and that they have much longer and more complicated lives. So maybe someone needs, can someone mute their microphone maybe? It's unmuted. Thanks. So we're lucky to have 3 speakers who illuminate 2 moments of material life cycles that can be otherwise hard to see. First, their extraction as ores and minerals are turned from land into commodity, and second, their supposed end of life, when their use in a building is typically over and they become so-called waste. Over the past 500 years, colonial capitalist economies have reorganized the world into territories of cheap nature and labor, and over the last half-century, extraction through mining and harvesting has accelerated, harming ecosystems, producing vast landscapes of dangerous waste, and all through exploitative labor conditions. It's really difficult to grapple with this reality when the material lives that so many of us experience are really just a slice of this through the technology that connects us right now and the beautiful buildings and landscapes that we might be participating in making. So the topic asks us to confront these contradictions, and we don't really need to look very far. If Canada is an extraction nation, Southern Ontario is the financial capital of this industry. The office buildings that rise in the GTA mirror the physical and financialized holes dug in countries around the world. And even closer to home, Waterloo Architecture is located in the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the 6 Nations of the Grand River in 1784 for their use forever, but was largely sold off by the Crown. The 6 Nations of the Grand River continue to struggle with land and financial grievances, calling on the province to follow the guidance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One example that relates to tonight's topic are proposals for resource sharing benefits for the many aggregates and gypsum that are extracted within the Haldimand Tract, which are the literal foundations of the buildings that people in the school might be designing with or living inside. So the organizers of this event are making a donation in support of the land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane, and for those interested in learning more, we'll be sharing a link in the chat. So with that, thanks again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to Yiming Wu to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thanks, Jane. So for tonight's lecture, we have 3 speakers with a diverse collection of both theoretical and practical work in varying yet interrelated fields which tackle environmental, geopolitical, and economic challenges by engaging and mobilizing local communities in a ground-up approach. Their combined work on anti-extractivism with adaptive reuse of materials gives us a broad glimpse into a wide range of possible, actionable scenarios for creating sustainable futures. I'm very happy to introduce Martin Arboleda, who's an assistant professor at the Universidad Diego Portales, Joan Kuyak, who is a community organizer and activist educator, May Bowley, who is the executive director of Repurposed Savannah. Before I get into a detailed introduction, before each speaker, starting with our first, Martin Arboleda, I'll quickly introduce Elijah Brahmanis and Lucy Lin, whose interests mirror the topics of our evening's presenters. They will be moderating tonight's Q&A. Elijah's thesis research focuses on studying the spatial stories of mining waste and the concept of care in the cleanup of abandoned mines. And Lucy's thesis focuses on how building craft enhances the process of deconstruction and material reuse, and how the process enables craft training in reverse. So, Martin Arboleda is an assistant professor of sociology at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile. His research explores the role that primary commodity production performs in the political economy of global capitalism. His fields of interest include global political economy, critical social theory, and agrarian studies. He's the author of the book Planetary Mine, Territories of Extraction Under Late Capitalism, as well as a forthcoming book on radical economic planning, to be published in Spanish by Caja Negra Editora in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His articles on the political economy of extraction in Chile and Latin America have been published in scholarly journals such as Geoforum, Journal of Agrarian Change, Antipod, and Society in Space, as well as non-academic outlets such as Jacobin Magazine, Jacobin America Latina, and Harvard Design Magazine. He is currently working on a long-term research project on the political economy of the globalized agro-food system, as well as the social and political history of agrarian planning in Latin America. We're happy to have you as our first speaker, and take it away.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Yi, and thank you very much, Jane and colleagues, for this wonderful and exciting invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you this evening. Well, my presentation starts with the image of the port of Mejillones, which is a port facility located 20 kilometers north of Antofagasta, which is the largest mining city in Chile. And Mejillones is a port facility built on a greenfield site, right? Which means that it was built exclusively for to have a exclusive dedication to the mining industry. Chile, as some of you might have known, is the largest producer of copper in the world and one of the major producers of lithium in the world. So it supplies nearly 30 to 35% of the world's copper consumption. And a considerable part of the copper that is exported goes through the port of Mejillones, right? And in 2013, a group of precarious port workers at Mejillones decided to organize and mobilize to demand for better working conditions, and more specifically for half an hour of remunerated lunch break. They set up barricades, they completely paralyzed all port operations, and immediately many other ports across Chile in solidarity also shut down port operations. And this workers' mobilization was met with fierce and swift repression by the state, right? Which unleashed, several, police trucks, water cannons, tear gas. Many of the workers were arrested, and some of them even taken to, a police station and even tortured. And anyway, they were met with fierce repression. And it's very important. I mean, this strike was very important in the consolidation of, like a nationwide import movement with connections to, like a anti-extractivism movements as well. And why is the strike of Mejillones important? I think that Mejillones, and I will argue that the port strike at Mejillones encapsulates and is a microcosm of, like four world historical shifts in the global political economy of extraction, right? So to begin with, this place, Mejillones, is built on a greenfield site, which means that has exclusive dedication to the mining industry. And it speaks to a general tendency where the proliferation of ports and other logistical infrastructure of this sort means that, an erstwhile insular focus on the extraction site has been gradually superseded by a deliberate organizational emphasis on the supply chain, understood as an integrated logistical system that encompasses extraction, smelting, processing, and transport, right? And this means that what is at stake at the political economy of extraction right now is not only the control of the shafts and the pits where the minerals are wrested from the soil, but the control over flows, right? And this is something that I'll come back to in a minute, but that's the first, like aspect that is worthwhile noting in this 2013 strike. Second, most of the exports that are handled by the Port of Mejillones are directed towards China. This means that contemporary dynamics of resource extraction have become entangled in a complex apparatus of production and exchange that supersedes the dynamics of a world system that was traditionally structured around global north and global south binaries, right? And this means that the notions of core and periphery are no longer, should no longer be circumscribed to national borders, right? As Achille Mbembe, the postcolonial theorist, in his book Critique of Black Reason, suggests, Europe is no longer the center of human civilization, right? So for the first time in history, we are living through a commodity super cycle where materials that are extracted are not taken to a Western or, like a Anglo-European manufacturing center, but are rather being shipped to our countries traditionally considered as peripheral or semi-peripheral. So this entails or pushes us to rethink the notion of core and periphery, global north and global south. Mejillones itself is the periphery of a highly unequal country where Santiago de Chile is one of the wealthiest cities in Latin America, and some parts of Santiago de Chile are actually an embodiment of the wealthy global north within the global south, just as many of like frontline communities struggling in resource extraction zones in the US or Canada and also embody the poor global south within the global north. And so that's the second element to be taken into account. Third, and this is a very important point as well, this strike also attests to the fact that struggles over the circulation and distribution of value have become increasingly relevant and predominant vis-a-vis struggles over the production of value. And why is this important? Because it has shifted the gravitational center of capital accumulation and political conflict from zones of extraction narrowly considered to the whole network of logistical infrastructure that enables the raw materials to travel towards consumer markets and become realized as money in the sphere of circulation. And this means that some of the most dramatic and crucial struggles against extractivism are now taking place precisely in this expanded sphere of circulation, just as is the port of Mejillones. And we can see how this plays out in many other settings in the world economy, right? Like many struggles today take place in across highways or financial centers, right? Toronto, as you know, like Jane was mentioning a while ago, is a core, a node in, like global network of financial power, and it has attracted, like activists who protest at, like general shareholders meetings. So this is another key instance where you can see how the sphere of circulation has become transformed into a space of where these new forms of class and interclass antagonism are being developed, right? And fourth, the global transformation of capitalist extraction has not signaled the withering away of the state, right? As was, like the general idea in early globalization theories, but rather it has been enabled by a more coercive, centralized, and militaristic configuration of the political authority of the late liberal state, right? And actually, extractivism has been considered a development model where there is a very complex entanglement between the free market and strong state authority, which is a feature, a kind of a feature of what the late neoliberal configuration of state authority has morphed into. And okay, so basically these sort of, like four elements point us to the fact that just like early globalization gave rise and was enabled by the existence of a world factory, right? Let's think of the maquila system or the modular production systems that led up to, like factories in Shenzhen producing electronic devices for the world market. There is also a geography of extraction that corresponds to this historical period of capitalist development, which I have termed in my book Planetary Mind, it is the Planetary Mine, which is the geography of extraction that emerges as the most genuine product of these four interrelated historical transformations, right? So, and to speak about the existence of the planetary mine, of course, needs to entails an expanded or leads up to thinking about an expanded conception of extractivism, right? And I think that any sort of understanding or contemporary understandings of what does anti-extractivism mean need to supersede a narrow conception of extractivism as just the wresting of minerals or foodstuffs or oil from the soil, right? And there are several authors that have been trying to push forward this expanded conception of extractivism, beginning with Veronica Gago in Argentina, Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen in Anglophone academia, and more recently, Saskia Sassen, who has also claimed that, for example, the financial system or finance has become remarkably similar to the operations of the extractive industries, right? And an important thing to mention that this sort of expanded geography and interrelated geography of extraction has also engendered and given rise to new and more advanced modalities of social and economic interdependence between workers across the global economy. And these relations of interdependence, although they are very real and have a concrete material existence, most of the time remain hidden from everyday consciousness, right? And here, writing at the early phases of the new International Division of Labor, Maria Mies, the radical feminist scholar who authored the book Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, argued that globalization, the expansion of globalization, had led to the paradoxical effect whereby first world women and third world women had become materially connected, yet subjectively fragmented by commodity production, right? Because the first, as a consumer, didn't know that the other one, as a producer in the factory, were actually the precondition for the existence of the other. And something similar happens today with contemporary struggles against extractivism across frontline communities in the ports, logistics, mining, oil industries, where there have been efforts to organize across these various realms of the spatial and technical division of labor, but there is still like an important work of like organizing and creating solidarity between these different very variegated elements. And actually, as Enrique Viale, an Argentinian scholar, activist scholar, who has been one of the authors arguing for an expanded conception of extractivism, precisely has argued that we need bridges to connect those who resist mining in remote places, those who stand up to glyphosate and the agribusiness, and those who live in ever more expensive, fenced, and repressive cities. He says that it is a single struggle, that the nodes and the pathways and the conduits are becoming much clearer every time. And but like that these links of solidarity are yet to be built and developed, right? And so that's one of the fundamental political implications of this new geography of extraction that is the planetary mine, right? And there is also something very particular about this configuration of extraction. So in the sense that it becomes more technologically advanced, it becomes able to mine larger mineral deposits and deposits that were unprofitable because they were lower grade become profitable because of there is more capacity to process larger volumes of rock, which means that the planetary mine is also connected to the production of larger and ever increasing quantities of waste. And actually, according to Ernest Mandel, one of the crucial theorists of late capitalism, one of the main consequences of the international centralization of capital and the emergence of new formations of monopoly power is the fact that it leads to the wasteful allocation of ever-increasing economic surpluses towards infrastructures, the credit system, the built environment. And so the question of waste and the wasteful production of surplus in this extractive capitalist economy is a huge also challenge for any forms of political organizing. So it's very exciting to know that several here of you are interested precisely in this question of mining reclamation, reuse of waste in the extractive industries. So yeah, that's basically, to summarize, it is like one of the largest challenges to think extraction beyond extraction and to shift the center of gravitation from the sphere of value production towards the sphere of circulation. And I think that is one of the, and also of course beyond established and inherited conceptions of the world system as structured across global north and global south binaries, right? So thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Martin, for opening up tonight's discussion and a great overview of how we might be able to think of extractivism and anti-extractivism sort of in our contemporary world. The next two speakers will speak about similar themes and ideas more locally. The first one being Joan Kuyak. Joan Kuyak is a community-focused mining analyst, community organizer, and adult educator living in Ottawa. She was the founding national co-coordinator of Mining Watch Canada from 1999 to 2009. She is the author of Unearthing Justice, How to Protect Your Community from the Mining Industry, and Community Organizing, a Holistic Approach, and a number of other books and publications. Before moving to Ottawa, she was a community organizer and facilitator for almost 30 years in Sudbury and other parts of Canada. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Just want to get my slides up here. So I thought what I would do today is just talk very specifically about the Ring of Fire and in Northern Ontario, and use it as an example of the kinds of things that I think we need to pay attention to. We have to respect the awesome cost of the minerals we take for granted. Mining is a waste management industry. It is at the cutting edge of colonialism, as Martin has said. It affects the whole structure of our economy. And in Ontario, this is a really, really serious problem. I had the honor 2 years ago to go to Neskantaga in Northern Ontario and talk to the people there about mining. They're the only community in the Ring of Fire area right now that is opposing this huge mineral development. And they're doing it in the midst of really, really, really difficult circumstances. And I want to honor who they are and what they've done. The Ring of Fire is a area of about 60 kilometers in diameter in Northern Ontario. It's about 540 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay, and it's about 330 kilometers from the nearest rail line at Nakina. None of the deposits in this huge yellow and brown area you see on the map are economic to mine unless the province or the federal government pays for this over 300-kilometer road that has to go up to the site.
Joan, sorry to interrupt. I think your screen didn't end up sharing. Can you try again?
Oh, no. Oh, dear. Okay. Sorry about that. Is it up now? No?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see the map now.
You can see the map. I'm going to go back, if I can, just quickly. And I started with this slide, which is to respect the awesome cost of the minerals we take for granted. That's the theme of what I'm talking about. And I want to honor at the beginning of this talk the people of Neskantaga in Northern Ontario, where I was able to do a workshop 2 years ago around the impacts and problems with the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is this yellow and brown area that you see here in Treaty 9. It's about 540 kilometers north of Thunder Bay and 330 kilometers north of Nakina. And it would require a road along an esker to make this mine economic. It will only, the road is going to cost at least $2 billion. There have been no completed feasibility studies for any of the proposed projects in this area that's over 60 kilometers in diameter, except for one for Eagle's Nest. And that one, which is now almost 10 years old, didn't include the road and the costs. The mineral claims for the Ring of Fire are in the watersheds of three enormous undammed rivers that run into Hudson Bay, the Attawapiskat, the Winnisk, and the Ekwan, and the Albany River is also crossed by the proposed road. The region is intact boreal forest in the James Bay lowlands. It's muskeg peatlands with enormous importance for carbon storage and sequestration. It provides enough wild foods to satisfy caribou, wolverine, wolves, and moose. There's a number of, the rivers are full of fish. And the only people who live in the Ring of Fire region are are indigenous in Neskantaga, Yabamatung, Martin Falls, Webequie, and Nibiaminik. And downstream on the James Bay coast, there's Attawapiskat, Winnisk, Pewanik, Saskatchewan, and Fort Albany. The communities on the coast are opposed to this because they've had an experience of mining, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the other ones are very torn over whether they should have the mine or not. And the reason for that is that this is the area of Treaty 9. It was signed in 1905 with an adhesion in 1929. And the treaty, which has since been discredited for a number of reasons, caused these people to say that they would cede, release, yield up, and surrender all their lands in exchange for a Union Jack, payments of $5 annually, reserve lands of 1 square mile for each 5 members of a family, and a promise of education. The treaty was signed in the midst of waves of epidemics that had knocked out 50 to 75% of the people each time. There was starvation because of a dearth of beaver at that point. They were lied to about what was actually in the treaty. The translators didn't tell them the truth. And they ended up with less than 0.2% of their lands. 10 years later, the Indian Act then defined who could be Indians, set up band councils for governance, restricted their movements, told them they said they had no right to hire lawyers, to own the land or business, or to practice their culture. They didn't get the vote until 1960. And the educational provisions led, of course, to residential schools. The result has been for the Indigenous people in Treaty 9 are amongst the most oppressed and impoverished people in the country, and now they're facing an even greater social crisis. The chief of Neskantaga a couple of years ago said that 27 kids had tried to kill themselves that year and 10 of them had succeeded. The only mine that's happened in the Ring of Fire region is the Victor Mine. It lasted from 2008 till 2018. It had an open pit, waste rock that was absolutely enormous. It had processed kimberlite piles, processed water, and a camp. It hasn't been properly reclaimed. It won't be. I don't think they even know how to reclaim some of the portions of it. They're going to let the pit fill with water, which will cause drawdown in the waters elsewhere. And there's been mercury contamination in the Ottawaska River from this. At the time that the mine was being built, the people who lived in Attawapiskat were told that it was going to bring them jobs and benefits, and instead what it's brought them is considerable misery. The housing crisis got worse. There's been 2 statements of housing emergency since during the time the mine operated. There has been flooding and waste sewer backups, and now they're fighting with De Beers, who owns the mine, one of the richest mining companies in the world, owned by Anglo-American, over cleaning up containers of just camp garbage that have been left behind. It's up the people in Attawapiskat are deeply opposed to the building of the Ring of Fire and are very much afraid that it's going to further decimate their community. To understand what's going on, we have to look at how Ontario deals with mining. Ontario recently, in 2017, brought in a map staking system for the staking of claims, which is how minerals are owned. The mineral rights are separated from the surface rights, and the mineral rights belong to, quote, the Crown. And they say they have no discretion to refuse claims that may be staked by prospectors who want access to it. So all you have to do if you've got a prospector's license, which is one of the easiest things in the world to get, is go online and click on any vacant claims that you want or purchase claims from others. They're awarded on a first come, first served basis. And even if you've got a terrible reputation as a bad mine operator, the government will not refuse you. There is requirements to do work on claims, and the result of that is that exploration impacts grow substantially. These are the claims that for the Ring of Fire. The distance across here is about 60 kilometers. The yellowish claims are owned by Noront, which now has 85% of the claims in the area. The others belong to a few other companies. Originally, the deposit is expected to be mostly chromite, but in fact, what Noront wants to exploit is a carrot-shaped deposit of nickel, copper, and a few other metals. The chromite claims were originally owned by an American company called Cliffs Natural Resources, and they walked away from the claims in the middle of a feasibility study and sold them to Noront for $22 million. So Noront now has 85% of the claims in the region, and that's well over 156,000 hectares. The Noront project is being designed as a sort of designer mine to bring the First Nations who live nearby on side. It's an underground mine. It can be because of its shape. It says that they will mix the tailings, the waste that's left over after the milling process, with cement and put them underground, so there will be no tailings on surface. Again, they can't do it unless they get the road built. But this mine, although it might be one of the more low-impact mines I've ever seen, is in fact a Trojan horse for a whole bunch of other projects. Because once the road is built, they can then open up all these other mines. And you can see, this is from one of their corporate presentations. It starts with Eagle's Nest, it moves to Blackbird, then Black Thor, which is a huge open pit chromium mine with enormous tailings and waste rock, and a number of other chromium mines. And there's already been other companies that talk about the gold and the nickel and the copper zinc they might find. Now, some of this is just pure speculation, and we have no idea what's actually there. The problem with the chromite mines is that they're not economic to build unless they can also have a ferrochrome smelter and shipping from the ferrochrome smelter to markets elsewhere. The ferrochrome smelter, they intend to build in Sault Ste. Marie, in a brownfield site. The problem with ferrochrome smelters is that they produce chromium-6, which is an incredibly toxic substance. And people in Sault Ste. Marie have been organizing to try and stop it. But it's not just the smelter. There'll be the transport of any of these metals and their concentrates on the roads. The nickel concentrate from Eagle's Nest will probably be processed in Sudbury, adding to the tailings and impoundments in that city. And the metals and so on that are being produced there mostly lead to steel production. So they're part of a global supply chain. The impetus for projects like the Ring of Fire come from Ontario's other major mining centre, which is Toronto. Noront, the company behind Eagle's Nest and the whole Ring of Fire project, has two loan facilities, one with Franco-Nevada for $42 million and one with Australia's Wyloo Corporation for $18.3 million. The company has over 419 million shares outstanding at this point and a shareholder deficit of $40 million. They do manage, however, to pay their named executive officers over $2 million a year, no matter what goes on with the rest of the company. And that's because that's where the money that they raise from shares goes. The Ring of Fire would not be possible without subsidies from the federal and provincial government. From 2010 to 2016 alone, the federal government and the Ontario government put in more than $30 million to try and convince Indigenous people in the region that they should be on support of this mine. They had mining advisors in communities like Neskantaga that were being paid substantial sums to convince people to come on side with the mine, when what they really needed was suicide counselors. The Ontario government is one of the most mining-friendly jurisdictions in the country. And none of these mines would happen without the complete collusion and support from the state. Besides policing and other forms of just structural support for these industries, They maintain free entry and have no requirement for Indigenous consent before they stake, which means the third-party interest on the land is created right at the moment of staking. They have the lowest tax and royalty rates in the country. They have inadequate financial assurance against mine closure. And in fact, we're the only jurisdiction in the country that allows mining companies to self-assure against closure. And most of our mines will need care in perpetuity. We have no environmental assessment in Ontario for mines, smelters, or refineries. We give free water and reduced electricity rates to mines and smelters. We have totally inadequate monitoring and enforcement of any of these projects. And we support infrastructure for including the $1 billion that's intended for the Ring of Fire. The other thing that we have that isn't on this list actually is really, really terrible labor legislation, and we do not allow picketing at mine sites and so on, except in very limited numbers. So the collective bargaining is totally limited by state regulation. So who benefits? Well, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in 2014 did a study about how the huge benefits they expected from the Ring of Fire, $60 billion in gross domestic product. And they thought this big blue section here, that's who's going to benefit, mining. All the others are retail, construction, and utilities, administration support systems. First Nations aren't even on that chart. There is nothing indicating that any money is going to be returned to Indigenous people. So what do we need to do? What are people fighting for? Indigenous control over the region and the regional impact assessment that's being done by the federal government. The boundaries for that regional impact assessment have got to be based on watersheds and traditional use. We need to end free entry. That there should be no third-party interests on Indigenous lands without their consent. We need to support comprehensive environmental assessment for all mineral development in Ontario. There's none, as I said earlier. We need to require all mineral development to be based on full cost accounting, which would include looking at ecological, I've got a typo here, ecological, social costs, and perpetual care, and to internalize those costs to company ledgers. And we need to adequately fund economic and social alternatives to extraction and to end government incentives to the mining industry. And amongst those economic and social alternatives to extraction is certainly incentivizing recycling and the reuse of building materials and recycling of steel and other products like that. I did want to briefly mention lithium because there is some interest in lithium mining in Ontario and in cobalt, which are both seen as green alternatives these days. Both of them have huge limitations in terms of their environmental and social impacts, but there also is not enough of it to continue to produce electric vehicles as an alternative to fossil fuels. So this is the commercial. Please buy my book, and thank you for this.
Thank you, Jem. Our next speaker is May Bowley. May Bowley is an executive director of Repurposed Savannah, a nonprofit that seeks to have a positive impact on our local and global environment by reducing the harmful effects of demolition on the health of our neighborhoods, and by diverting large quantities of waste from the landfill, transforming it into community resources. Repurposed Savannah pays special attention to historical materials, particularly old-growth lumber that can be found in historic structures. May holds a Bachelor of Art in Graphic Design and a Bachelor of Art in Classical Archaeology from Florida State University. She holds a Master of Art in Art Education from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is currently earning a certificate in Historic Preservation from Savannah Technical College. Her professional background includes creative director for a manufacturing firm, market manager for an urban farm, and principal in her own marketing consultancy for creative startups, Bowley Creative. Thank you, May.
Hello, thank you so much. And thank you to our other presenters for giving a really intense and fascinating deep dive into what goes on behind the scenes, as Martin suggested. Let me try to share my slides here. We good? Okay. Somebody let me know if that's not working. So I'm May Boli. My nonprofit is called Repurposed Savannah, and we're working on the ground, as it were, to try to fight the battle to reduce the harmful impacts of my main focus, my industry being construction and demolition. You can't really talk about building anymore without talking about demolition. Land use is at a maximum. There are more people on the planet than we've ever had before. So if we're talking about building something, if we're talking about architecture, we are inevitably talking about demolition. Most buildings don't live forever, unless, as the adage goes, George Washington slept there, although I think we should change it to, did Martin Luther King sleep there? Then it's likely to reach the end of its life cycle at some point. So our nonprofit, we engage in the very primary activity of deconstruction, which is unbuilding a building, going backward in the order that it was built to harvest as much material as possible and divert as much as we can from the landfill. We harvest gorgeous materials. We do primarily focus on historic building materials for a lot of reasons. And we also do a lot of work with local education programs, local colleges here in Savannah, as well as groups like yours that invite us to speak on the subject. Here we've got students from the local College of Art and Design, as well as the Technical College. We work with these students to aggressively document and research the buildings that we're about to take down so that they don't disappear from the landscape. All of the research that we conduct is alive and well on our website. Here's an example of one of the pages. And I'm going through this really fast because we're going to get to the meat of it here in a minute. In most cases, we're able to produce an unbroken chain of residents from when the building was built until when we took it apart, and keep all those stories and histories alive. All the materials that we reclaim come back to our reuse lumberyard here in Savannah, and they're available for sale to the public. And you can check out a lot of the materials on our website, although it's by no means comprehensive. There's a lot. And the reason that we do this is, there are quite a few, but we're going to start with the really obvious environmental aspects. Here in the United States, municipal solid waste, all the cities and towns, all the people in America, these wasteful Americans, we produce a little under 300 million tons of garbage annually. That was in 2018. We know it's probably gone up quite a bit since then. Construction and demolition is responsible for generating more than twice that amount. So for all of us who bear the burden of personal responsibility for climate change, take a little breath, because we're not doing as bad as some players in the field. In fact, a single American house, your average American house, is roughly equivalent in tonnage to the volume of garbage produced in an entire American lifetime. So every house we divert from the landfill, we're offsetting an entire American person from cradle to grave. Most buildings in at least North America are built, or at least residential buildings are built from trees, and trees do many incredible things, but most noteworthy, they eat CO2 for a living. But unlike in a wild forest, where trees are able to age and die and then fall over and contribute to the ongoing ecology, trees in an urban environment and in the houses that they are then built out of, as they age and begin to die, they represent a risk, a liability. And here in Savannah, this is pretty relevant. The city's working on capping their municipal or their exposure to liability for fallen tree limbs. We have a lot of historic building stock here, and they do tend to be demolished, whether it's acts of God or by neglect. They're not all in excellent repair like you see in the postcards and brochures. So because they represent a risk or a liability, they are landfilled. We got to get them out of there, cut them down, tear them down, demolish them, and put them in the landfill where all that wood is swiftly converted back into CO2, which of course accelerates climate change, which increases the intensity of storms, which increases the liability and risk of aging timber. And I'm going to mention that my organization focuses not only on the built environment, but also the urban tree canopy, which is largely landfilled and not harvested for reuse. We focus particularly on old growth trees because they are at least 10 times more carbon dense than new growth. It's pretty shocking to hold a 2x4. You could say, cut yourself a 1 foot length of 2x4 from Home Depot that you just bought yesterday and hold it up next to a length of one of my 2x4s and you'd be shocked. You can stick your thumbnail into the styrofoam that you just bought from Home Depot, and my old growth is harder than a nail. In case and by weight, it's stronger than steel. Many of the species that were used to build historic homes across North America are now endangered or extinct. They represent a pretty important heritage for that reason alone. I have three of my favorites here. The American elm, which was mostly wiped out by Dutch elm disease. The longleaf pine, which was dominant in my region, which was the victim of Smokey the Bear. This is a tree that requires fire to propagate. And as a result of, the political war against wildfires to protect logging interests has, failed to thrive. And then last, the American chestnut, which was one of the most dominant species on the eastern seaboard. It was called the eastern redwood and was wiped out by a fungus in a matter of 30 years. It was 1 in every 10 trees on the eastern seaboard, and now we don't have any more. Well, maybe like 2 or 3. Historic wood is very beautiful, and this relates not only to the importance of, protecting it and harvesting it for reuse, but also will speak to the socioeconomic concerns that we have to grapple with when we talk about locating our reuse strategies in a domestic setting, as opposed to sort of the global extractivism that we're trying to, counterbalance here. So in a new model, the model we try to, propagate with our work here in Savannah is, yes, we have trees, they eat CO2, we make houses out of them, and as they age and die, they represent a real asset to our community instead of a liability. If we are able to harvest them before they reach critical loss, before the house collapses, before the tree starts dropping limbs on people's Mercedes and they're suing the city, we can create many things rather than releasing CO2 into the oxygen. We're keeping it sequestered in the bodies of these trees. We're generating a product that has real value. And I can speak to that because me and all of my crew eat off of this plate. It generates jobs and it keeps the meaning and community circulating within the local context where it has its most potency. I have to plug one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite books is that trees are a bridge between the earth and the sky, and also the past, the present, and the future. That meaning is really important and significant, and it has an extremely important, role that has played in the history of the human animal. Of course, obviously, these materials being harvested for reuse can then flow back into neighborhoods that are at risk for loss in the form of home repairs. Material reuse is not a new idea. It is a historic practice. It's as old as building itself. In fact, what we can think of as traditional or contemporary demolition is in fact not traditional. It's a relatively new invention, at least in the wholesale, the way it's conducted today. I've seen evidence of reused materials in every house I've ever worked on. These are outboard motor crates that we found in one of our projects from Waukegan, Illinois, right here in Savannah to build a wall. I can't get over how pretty some of the stuff we find is. Let's get back to C&D. Construction and demolition is a $7.4 billion industry. That's a big apple. Only 10% of the jobs in that very money-making industry are held by women. The majority of those are in high-level office positions. Only 1 in 100 site workers are women. So our nonprofit, as we try to solve every problem at once, has decided to focus specifically on a training program for women. There are a lot of reasons why women don't land these jobs in construction, the gender bias being probably the biggest one. Lack of adequate training programs is a pretty significant one as well. We're the only one I know of in our region. There's few, they're popping up around the country, and the federal government's doing a lot to try to incentivize training programs for women in non-traditional organizations. We don't have any of their money yet, but we're trying. So here's me and some of my crew. Here we are on the job site. For the most part, a lot of women, I think, at least in my experience, have hesitated to join programs where they'd be in the minority. It's already enough to be harassed on the street. We don't want to be harassed in school. So something about a training program that's geared specifically toward development of skills to the point where women are competitive in the job market has become really effective. And we've graduated 2 women at this point. We're pretty new, and we've got a batch of 4 on the way, and we're about to upgrade in partnership with the local technical college. Favorite things about this work is not only does it feel incredible to salvage a house that was going to head to the landfill, also a lot of the women that come to work for me are a little bit, they weren't born into the birthright of, tool use that I think a lot of men are born into. So Kirsten, for example, who was absolutely terrified to hold a saw when I first met her, by the end of a year was up in a 40-foot boom lift, sawing sections of wall off and dropping them to the ground like a pro. It's incredible to behold. Another major reason that we focus on deconstruction versus demolition is that demolition is extremely toxic for the neighbors. It's a public health concern. We know this because in wealthy communities and white communities, particularly here in the United States, any demolition that's going on in these neighborhoods is going to be tented, or there's going to be a full-time staff member who's paid to spray water to prevent the dust from getting all over the neighbors. They don't want that dust on them. I did a quick analysis. This was in June, so it needs to be updated for the full scope of the year. But up until the point in June, I went into the permit department office here in Savannah and pulled the address of every house that had received a demolition permit. And I took those addresses to the EPA environmental justice mapping tool, plugged them in, and discovered that within an eighth of a mile radius, I mean, we're talking really small radius, who are the people that are breathing in the dust of demolitions? 86% of them were minority, 82% low income, and we had a 77% lead paint indicator. Historic buildings have a lot of toxic stuff in them. Contemporary buildings have a lot of toxic stuff when you crush them up too, but a little bit less maybe than we find in our historic homes. Lead, asbestos, it's pretty intense. I highly recommend taking a look at this book by Francesca Russallo-Ammon. It's incredibly helpful in the way that it helps to analyze the relationship between demolition, racism, and classism in the history of the practice. As I say, demolition as we know of it today is a relatively recent invention, roughly dating to the end of World War II, where we had developed a lot of earth-moving technologies such as the bulldozer. And it gave rise to a lot of new projects after the war, terms that we think of now with a little bit of a cringe, that are a little bit synonymous with demolition, racism, and classism, such as urban renewal, historic preservation, which I claim to be a part of, asterisk, blight reduction, and all these terms, which we know now tend to target the decimation of low-income, poor, and minority communities for the benefit of development of wealthy housing or upper middle class. We can look at Portland. Portland has the first deconstruction ordinance in the history of the United States. In 2016, Portland made it illegal to demolish a building that was 1915 or older. You can still take it down, but you have to deconstruct it by hand, which does not release the toxic dust cloud that demolition does. Demolition, which is a crush and run over and landfill model. And in Portland, they, of course, keep track of a lot of this stuff. And even though a demolition permit requires the abatement of hazardous material, in 50% or more of their deconstruction projects, additional hazardous materials were discovered in the course of deconstruction, which means that if they're not getting deconstructed by hand, if they're just getting crushed, even if abatement rules are being enforced, which they rarely are, at least half of those still contain hazardous materials that are being, turned into toxic dust clouds and rained on the neighbors. That's important. I should also note, I think of historic buildings as sort of the wedge to try to get the municipalities on board for wholesale deconstruction. I think the goal has got to be 100% of structures, but we can start with historic buildings as they have in Portland. In 2016, they said 1915 was the cutoff, and as of January this year, January 2020, they expanded that ordinance to include buildings up to 1940. And I highly anticipate that that number is going to grow, which means thousands and thousands of more buildings are going to be deconstructed by hand. Less of it's going to be landfilled. More of it is going to be circulated into reuse, and far less of a public health crisis. Having mentioned that it's very pretty, I think one of the hooks for me is the absolute romance of this historic lumber. It's hard to really describe it until you spend a lot of time with this wood, how special and beautiful it is. I do want to talk about extraction, though, in a domestic setting. I think a lot of what we do tends to have a shiny gleam on it. Seems like a pretty nice solution on a small scale. And I love to talk about scaling up to an industrial level, but I want to pause to talk about a serious concern that I have. As I suggested, many of the buildings that are getting demolished in my urban environment and across the country are located in minority communities and low-income communities. This is my client, Mary Simmons, and her mother's house. They are residents in a neighborhood here in Savannah called Historic Coffee Bluff, which was settled after the emancipation of enslaved peoples by freed former slaves who moved to the area and set up a fishing village. Mary and her family, and this is her daughter and granddaughter, they're the direct descendants of these freed folk who settled the neighborhood. This is a very desirable community. It is rapidly gentrifying. It has been for a long time. When I advertised that this house was becoming our project up on our social media, you wouldn't believe the comments I got from some of the neighbors, the white neighbors, who said they were so glad to see this eyesore removed from their community. it's not their community. Mary and her family have been there since long before anybody there. Her great-great-grandfather purchased the land in 1965, 2,000 acres of it for $135. Excuse me, 1865. And this parcel that she's holding onto with her bloody fingernails is the only thing that they have left. So, you know, we, of course, are very glad to bring a microphone to the story and history. Local organizers have been heavily involved in trying to get the word out. They just got this historic marker put up in 2019, recognizing the historic significance for the Black community. But I have to say, as much as I'm proud of the fact that we didn't, you know, spray the neighbors with toxic dust, and that we didn't allow all of this to go to the landfill, and that we've helped facilitate Mary holding onto her property, we still harvested all that stuff, and it is for sale. And who are our clients? They are upper middle class to wealthy white folks. So as much as it's important that we do as much as we can to try to bring our solutions to a local community, I think it's also really important that we don't replace global extractivism from the global north and from the global south to the global north to smaller local versions of extractivism where we're harvesting materials from and heritage from people's communities and selling it off to the highest bidder. Something to consider, a challenge for all of you guys. I hope to leave it on a positive note. But thank you very much for giving me the time to introduce our project. I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you, May, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for your presentations. So before we continue to the discussion part, let's take a quick 3-minute break to stretch or get a glass of water. So let's meet back at 7:35. Thank you. Okay, I think we can get started again. May, I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen, and then we can get all the speakers back up on.
Did I get it?
Yep. So if you speakers want to turn your cameras back on, that'd be great, and we'll start the discussion portion. So it's been really great hearing your talks in relation to one another, as you are all working on an interconnected issue from various ends. Lucy and I are currently working on our graduate theses. I'm looking at the afterlives of mines, and Lucy is researching building craft in relation to material use, which both follow the journey of building materials, where they come from, what processes are involved in their production, and at the end of a building's life, where they end up going. So to get things started, we have prepared a question for all three speakers. Afterwards, we would like to open the floor to questions, comments, and shared experiences from the audience. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat right now, or you can wait and raise your hand during open discussion.
Okay, so to get started, we have a question about each of your work in relation to one another's. Your work occurs at various scales, from an individual building or community to a national or global scale. How do you approach or address these scales within your own work? And after listening to each other's presentation, I want to ask Joan and Martin how your research, how do you envision your research intersects with material reuse, and how may you connect your work to material extraction?
Well, I'll go. They're both huge questions, and I always think of the kind of work that I do now, working with local communities, as a process of trying to make all these global forces that are shaping and disorganizing their lives visible to them. And not just visible to them, but trying to help them build some power and understanding of how they can resist those forces. Because what we do know is that they get resisted in the local level. I mean, I lived in Sudbury for 30 years, and there were all sorts of attempts to build international solidarity around labor struggles, which were in fact pretty pathetic, if you really want to know. I mean, people didn't know much about the other workers. They were busy with what they had. They weren't that. The company's response every time something like that happened was to introduce new technologies and reduce the number of workers. Like these mines I was talking about in the Ring of Fire will be mostly working with very, very few laborers, very few. And you can be sure they'll be working in conditions where they can't even talk to each other very much. I mean, open pits mean they're in trucks and their lunch hours are staggered. It's different than working on a rock face blasting. And the issues in terms of how people understand what they can do about the power of these huge and interrelated corporations are really big ones. People taking on fossil fuel extraction, for example, have focused on pipelines here as a way to try and stem the force of the sort of industrial project. And we do know that a very small number of people in the long run benefit from all this stuff. So making it transparent and trying to put it in terms that people understand and helping them meet each other and work together. It's organizing no matter how you do it, and it's mostly local, and people do it best when they can actually meet and talk with each other. And there's vulnerabilities. I mean, there's a lot of work done in Indigenous communities in Canada of trying to establish where the vulnerabilities are in these massive extraction projects. And it's interesting, there are a lot, actually. They're very, very dependent on the smooth functioning of an awful lot of things that can be disrupted quite easily. But how that translates into the creation of alternatives is another issue. While we're talking about this, I mean, there are people working to create alternatives. Your next session, I think, is on food sovereignty, for example, and certainly the trying to get capital and support and protection to these locally based resistance activities and helping them work and connect with one another is to me incredibly important. I mean, we tend to sort of people tend to dismiss that, but in fact, for anti-extraction activists, the building of the alternative economy is what will make the difference, and finding ways to nurture that. So I'll stop there. I just said plenty.
I want Martin to chime in because they're coming at this from such a big scale. But I want to say here in our tiny little microcosm of trying to fight the good fight, we often talk about the difference between the carrot approach and the stick approach, which I think is very similar to what you were just talking about. How can we ask industries to shift to an alternative model if there are no practitioners, if there's no training programs? So by building the infrastructure and proving the model, as it were, on a local level, we can then follow up with enforcement like they did in Portland. That's the model that they followed in Portland. It was through grassroots organizing, nonprofit organizations, building an industry around material reuse that they were then able to follow up with the ordinance, which required it of the industry, and the industry shifted.
Wow, that's very interesting. Like really, really interesting reflections. And I think, Joan is right to suggest that, like the question of scale has to do, like precisely with making transparent or visible how, like these global interconnected, intricate forces shape the lives of local communities, right? And that creates a sort of empowerment. And again, like to refer again to Maria Mies's landmark book, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale. That was precisely what she said, that the challenge for feminist politics was precisely to lay bare those connections which the international and sexual division of labor had made obscure and unintelligible and like non-perceptible. So, like that for me, like it's a really methodological and political motivation to look at the scalar dimension of extraction from, like the local site of extraction, like this port city that I was talking about before, towards, like manufacturing in China, like shipping, transoceanic shipping. And the question of recycling, like I was, like fascinating presentation by Megan, and actually my more recent work has gravitated and shifted towards the question of agroecology, which also centers on the recycling and reuse of many farm inputs and materials, basically to reduce dependency from external inputs and to create more direct connections between the production of food waste in cities with like a food production in agrarian contexts. And the food sovereignty movements in Latin America are gaining a lot of ground, are going strong, and so far they still haven't made any like important breakthroughs in terms of like political organization, anything comparable to what were like the land and agrarian reforms of the mid 20th century. But nonetheless, they have articulated into this wide transnational movement organized around La Villa Campesina, which is supposedly the largest social movement in the world, and it's structured around pretty interesting, like a principle of, like a food production, agroecological food production centered on the reuse and recycling of farm inputs and materials. So I think it's, like fascinating how, like how the question of waste, in my early work, I didn't touch upon it. I knew that it was fundamental, extremely relevant, but I didn't touch upon it directly. And now I'm looking at it through agriculture, which like also provides a fascinating glimpse into how to look at the topic.
I find agriculture to be one of the most fascinating and simple models for reuse. It's like food waste, turn it into compost, grow more food, done. It's like I used to work with the Resource Center in Chicago, which composted on a very large scale using big cement trucks and collecting from all the major restaurants in the city, growing urban farm, city farm, urban food. It's such an eloquent poem, and it's a model that we need to replicate in other industries as well, like in the built environment. And well, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, to Martin's point, alternative methods of organizing, anti-patriarchal, collective banding together. We're doing it right now. Like here we are connecting the large picture and the small picture. And I know I'm one of the only ones in my region working to elevate the cause of deconstruction. But I'm connected to a national network of other folk who are working to do this, and that keeps me going. It is collective organizing that. I seem like a very tiny little piece of the puzzle, but when you zoom out, when you go to the national conferences, when you're on these calls and connecting to people that are all working together, it starts to become a lot more fearsome an effort. I think that is gaining momentum.
I think we need to work on sort of 3 levels. And one of them is the resistance has to be against creating more of these toxic sites. I mean, mining is a waste management industry. For every, gram of gold that's produced, there's 5 to 6 tons of toxic waste that's going to be there and have to be cared for in perpetuity. It's true in all sorts of things. In fact, if you look at the effects of the Green Revolution and some of the toxic inputs in agriculture, it creates the same kind of wastelands. And I think that resistance to creating more waste, more toxic waste, is really, really crucial. That it's part of protecting enough space so we can actually regrow something. We can actually make something else happen. And then there's the creation of the alternatives, and the work to build them, which is incredibly hard work. It's really, really hard work. And an awful lot of people don't understand just how hard that is and don't support it to the extent. It requires huge capital inputs and it requires huge labor inputs, and people don't seem to understand that awfully well. It's very badly underfunded. And those indigenous communities I talked about, people are working every day just to try and keep the community alive and keep the kids together, right? I mean, they're working very, very, very hard all the time. So there's those 2 pieces too, right? Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was really inspiring to hear about how when you address like transparency and visibility, it kind of works both sides, because usually we only focus on one end, either from like bottom up or top down, and then it actually creates a lot more understanding and momentum when you address it from 2 sides. So I think we're approaching like some 50, so we would like to open the floor to questions, comments, and shared experiences from the audience, which you can ask either in the chat or by raising your virtual hand if there's questions. Well, if not, so Naira here has a question. Do you want me to read it, or would you rather?
You read it.
Oh, I can read it? Okay. So she said, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but Joan said that it is really simple to register as a prospector and file for mineral rights. If that's the case, would it not be possible for activists to file for the rights and then not develop the mine?
Well, there have been people who do what they call biostaking, but frankly, it would never stand up in court, because the law says very specifically that it has to be for the purposes of building a mine. And in most of these cases, any of the stuff that's people find out after their land's already been staked, like that's when they start getting active. There is a case in the Yukon where the Cascadene challenged the right of mining companies to stake their land, and they won. They won, and it went to appeal, and they won at appeal. It hasn't been applied in other jurisdictions in Canada, but frankly, in the Yukon, for the Casca, they can now provide or not provide consent to staking. The problem is that the previous staking hasn't been voided, so there's a whole question around the lands that were already staked. And that's what's been happening almost everywhere. They've staked so much land that trying to unstake it means them paying huge amounts of, the government's paying compensation to these greedy buggers who staked it in the first place, and so it's a problem, but it really is at the basis of it, and the right. The tiny little bit any of us could ever stake wouldn't do anything about the bigger issue. And the bigger issue is that we've got to stop free entry. We just got to stop it.
Looks like there's another question in the chat for May. Max is wondering if you could talk a little bit more about scaling up deconstruction.
Yeah, the challenge is just talking a little bit about it. I will try to talk a little bit about it. I do think a lot about this. We're talking about global extraction and global mining. I mean, how can taking apart a building stick by stick ever compete with not even talking about industry, just talking about construction and demolition industry, which is a tiny part of what we're discussing here in terms of industry. How can what we're talking about ever operate on that scale? What are the things I want to say? I want to say there's a guy in Michigan who's working on a denailing robot. That's going to be a pretty big deal for us. Honestly, because what we do is extremely labor intensive. But on the realistic side of things, construction is labor intensive. There are a lot of industries that are labor intensive. Demolition isn't, because you can do it with a guy, your uncle, with a backhoe. You don't have to be in Georgia. You don't have to be certified, bonded, or licensed to do demolition. Landfilling here is some of the cheapest in the country. Demolition is quick and it's cheap and it's easy. You run it over. It doesn't require a whole lot of brain science. That's how we start to compete against that. When we talk about scaling this up, we gotta incentivize industry to get in on the money. There's money to be had in this. I tell people all the time, if you don't care about heritage and history, if you don't care about the environment, let me talk about how much I sell these materials for. Maybe you'll care about that. There's value in reclaimed materials, particularly in the old growth. There's also value on an industrial scale. It's a resource. The enormous amount of materials that we're generating on an industrial scale can be processed for reuse. There's really exciting developments happening are you guys familiar with mass timber buildings? Google it. It's very cool. Concrete and steel are so carbon exhaustive. The production of concrete and steel generate so much carbon. They're declining in popularity and they're being replaced. This is in Forbes, you guys. This isn't like grassroots talk. On an industrial scale, skyscrapers are beginning to be built out of wood again, and they're doing it by cross-laminating timbers, which is taking a layer of wood and then a little bit of glue and then the opposite direction of a layer of wood. And pound for pound, it's twice as strong as steel. And you use the industrial waste to create that product, and they're using the industrial waste from logging, the pulpy crap, the stuff that you wouldn't turn into 2x4s anyways. And by that same logic, you can use reclaimed lumber as well. So the B grade, the not the beautiful stuff I'm showing you. That stuff should never be turned into cross-laminated timbers. That stuff should always be put in a museum. I think it's gorgeous. But the majority of our volume of building material waste is in 1980s 2x4s with a bunch of nails in it. It's not gorgeous. It can be used for these industrial scale practices. I talk a lot about the fact that the sensible system, the circular economy, is just a minor shift from what we're already doing. We're very close to operating at this scale already. It just takes a little tweak and more conferences like this. Does that answer the question?
If there aren't more questions in the chat, I can ask one. But if there's anybody else that wants to raise their hand or type, do it now.
I think we have time for like one or two more questions. So maybe Liga can ask the first one first, and then we can follow up with another one.
So green technology, like a solar panel or a wind turbine, requires a lot of metals, and at current rates will continue to increase the demand for mining. So I guess my question was, Joan, I know you already talked about lithium in Ontario in your talk as one of them, but in your research, how do you see this green transition affecting material extraction, and also, May, in terms of material reuse? I know you talked about mostly using heritage building materials or like older materials, but how does this affect your practice?
Well, we can't mine our way out of the climate crisis. I mean, there's quite a bit of material on the Mining Watch Canada site if people want to look at that, and there's other people who've been doing a lot of research on the materials that will be needed: copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earths. Almost all of them have huge consequences environmentally and socially, and if the powers that be do think are just chomping at the bit to keep expanding. But if we do that, we're creating a whole other problem. So we're going to be forced, one, to look at remining and recycling, for one thing. But we also have to start talking about how we distribute that money. Like, if everybody can't have an electric vehicle, that's not how it's going to work. We can't create armaments and keep creating new structures. So much of the metals we produce go into the into war, and so much of the metals we produce go into automobiles, and we can't just keep putting it into automobiles. We've got to restructure our transportation systems. I know it's hard to think about in COVID, but that we do. And if we don't do this, we're just going to be wrecking more and more of the planet with these large mines, large low-grade mines that Martin was talking about, with more and more industrial waste, and it'll just get worse. So the need to rethink what the green economy looks like in terms of the commons, in public transportation, in shared accommodation, in terms of small-scale agriculture. All those things are absolutely crucial, and it'll mean resisting and fighting back where mines are going to be destroying more of the planet and through their expansion or new ones at the same time.
It's hard to connect with. It's sometimes difficult for me to connect with the larger scale futures for building material reuse. I like to talk about it in theory space a lot. I always come back to funding. Joan keeps mentioning it. I mean, we scrape and we hustle to, and this is selling our luxury goods at a premium, and we're still just barely holding on. We're growing. Don't get me twisted. Like, we're growing, but it comes down to funding. So until and what Joan was saying earlier too about the legal system is rigged in favor of mining operations. So funding and legislation, right? Funding and the law. These are our avenues to create change. So when the new economy, the new green economy, when young people are anxious about the environment and aging up into drive the law to be more in favor of a sustainable future. This helps a great deal, and also help fund us. We need funding. All of us.
Yeah. We're being robbed. We need to take it back. I mean, that's really it.
Agree. And I talked at the end of my presentation about the problem of domestic and local extraction, which you can very easily fall into the same patterns on a small scale that you would do on a global scale. Ideally, in my case, I would love to be flowing the materials that I'm harvesting from poor communities right back into the repair of other homes that are failing in poor communities. I can't afford to. I need help. The city could subsidize a program to help me do that. But it's going to take a lot of legwork to make that happen. So we need allies in the political system, and we need programs to. They're out there. There are housing assistance programs that exist. They need to be funneled hardcore into sustainability operations that are also working for justice.
Thanks. I think we have time for just one last question, so maybe we can combine the ones that are in the chat for Martin. So there's one question about salvage punk. And the other question is to expand on Lucy's question on the environmental social consequences of mining materials such as lithium in Chile, and whether new regulations or policies are being introduced to manage increasing demand.
Yes, thank you for these questions. The two of them really, really interesting. And to begin with, like the question about lithium. Uh, Lithium has become an increasingly attractive investment like destination due to like ongoing energy transition towards like renewable solar and so on. But there is much concern on the fact that it has not been regulated enough, and everyone worries that it will work just as it happens with like copper extraction. But one interesting thing, and one thing that I find so inspiring about like making or like molding or democratically controlling the energy transition, has gravitated around like the idea or the project of the Green New Deal, which emerged in the Anglo-European world, but it has traveled to many other parts of the world. In Latin America, there is ongoing discussion around the idea of a Latin American Green New Deal, which is called Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, or Great Ecosocial Pact of the South. And it actually it's underpinned by the idea that any form of energy transition that uses lithium on an extensive basis would need to be heavily regulated, and also be connected to a revolution in transportation, because basically, as Joan was mentioning, you cannot just like the idea is not that everyone owns an electric vehicle, right? I mean, how we transport ourselves also has to change. How uh, um, housing buildings are retrofitted, transformed, or deconstructed, like also like a really important part of what would go into this Green New Deal. And in South America, the conversation on this is ongoing. And this also connects to some extent with the question of the salvage punk, which is an idea that's emerged from literary theory and cultural critique. Actually, it was coined by a science fiction writer and China Miéville and cultural theorist Evan Calder Williams, basically on the idea that any form of like post-capitalist future has to get to grips with the fact that there is no pre-industrial Arcadia that we cannot go back to. We just have to deal with the ruins of capitalism, and what should we do with these ruins of capitalism are a question that merits and is infused with politics, right? And that's why I find it like fascinating how the food sovereignty movement has taken very seriously the question of reusing, recycling, and closing the metabolic rift, right, between consumption and production. So yeah, I think we're just over the time, so I'll like cut it short. But I think like I think it's really important to bring, I mean, to render visible or pose the question of the role of the state in all this. And I think that the idea of a Green New Deal is, I think, an interesting way forward in how we shape and like democratically control any form of energy transition, so that it works like for the environment and for the common good.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. So as we're a bit over 8 o'clock, and in the effort to get you all off of your screens, I'd like to thank everyone in our virtual lecture hall for sharing this time and space to partake in these important conversations. And a very special thank you to Martin, Joan, and May for your generosity, the generosity of your time, knowledge, and insights. And thanks to everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Really great discussion. Bye.
Bye.
Yes.